Hi everyone, welcome to the ongoing motion debrief series by the Debaters Council of Sri Lanka. My name is Aliza. I'm the current debating coach of St. Thomas College, Mount Lavinia, and a former debater of both Hillwood and Bishop's College. In this video, I'm going to be dissecting the round 2 motion of the recently held APIIT debating tournament. The motion reads, "This House prefers a world in which religions do not encourage self-deprivation." Examples include ritual fasting, asceticism, and voluntary poverty. So the first thing I'm going to be going over is a few points that I think are important for teams to keep in mind when approaching the motion. Firstly, recognize that this house prefers that motion. So especially as a proposition, the burden is on you to really reconceptualize what religions are going to look like on your side of the house. You need to explain what things are going to change, how our perception of religion also would change on your side of the house. You need to draw the distinction at the top of your case itself. Secondly, I think it's important for both sides to try and define what self-deprivation is. So I know the motion gives you a couple of examples, but more so than the examples, what do you define as self-deprivation when you consider it as a concept, right? It is the belief that you should deny yourself certain things in the name of religion. So I think defining it as a concept at the top of your case itself might also be beneficial. Thirdly and finally, I think it is important for both sides to recognize that there is a lot of nuance in this motion. Self-deprivation is going to affect different stakeholders in entirely different ways. For example, an individual coming from a more moderately religious background isn't going to face the same issue of being coerced into these self-deprivating practices the same way an individual coming from a more conservative or extremist religious background would be, right? So considering that the motion isn't going to affect everyone the same way will help you strategize how you want to go about winning the debate, and also help you when it comes to clarity in building arguments. Moving on to proposition, I think for proposition, context is pretty important. You need to paint a clear picture as to why on proposition side of the house you're going to be eradicating a lot of the harms that is caused by self-deprivation. So you want to paint a clear picture as to what those harms are. I think something you can do here is explain that self-deprivation is essentially a race to the bottom. And this is because there is really no limit to the things that you can sacrifice in order to achieve higher levels of spirituality or in order to become more religious, right? Just because there isn't a limit to it, it becomes this race to the bottom where you're constantly sacrificing things that bring you happiness in order to try and achieve greater heights of spirituality. This can have a host of negative impacts on your physical, mental, and even emotional well-being, right? It could also extend to things like extreme economic impacts. For example, voluntary poverty could lead to you not even being able to afford a good education for your children. So really listing out the harms and really helping the house conceptualize the harms of self-deprivation is really going to be beneficial for you if you do it at the top of your case itself. I think the next thing that's pretty important is always giving a comparative, explaining to the house what your world would comparatively look like. And this is a world where religions don't encourage self-deprivation. This in turn would mean that people are no longer expected to constantly sacrifice their happiness in the name of religion. This would mean that religions are more inclusive and a much safer environment where people aren't constantly shamed for wanting to achieve happiness and success in life. So you could analyze it a little bit better to try and prove why in your world religions would be much better and a much safer environment. In terms of framing, I think the first thing you need to do as a proposition is really draw a line or explain what exactly you consider self-deprivation. So I think you can go about this by explaining that it is anything that requires a significant personal sacrifice on your part that can have negative consequences, right? So any form of restriction on autonomy, on clothing, on food, and in certain religions like Jehovah's Witness, it even extends to limitations of the kind of medical treatment you can get. So really explaining what you consider as self-deprivation is a really important point of framing. I think another thing you can do in framing is explain to the house that as proposition, you don't really have a problem with self-deprivation in and of itself. It's more so the problem really arises when religions encourage it, because now you create a standard for what a religious person should ideally look like, and that's when people feel coerced into self-denial in order to try and in order to try and become that ideal religious individual, and that is extremely harmful. I think the final point of framing that you can give as proposition is trying to explain how religions can still uphold all its other good moral values on your side of the house. Things like selflessness, empathy, and even aspiring to achieve contentment don't have to depend on self-denial, or don't have to depend on religions encouraging self-deprivation. These things can exist independently. I think it's important for you to give this point of framing because it acts as preemption, right? It is very probable that the opposition would run a line on how self-deprivation helps you become a more content individual. So trying to explain at the top itself how contentment can be achieved through things like just having a balance in life. You don't need to deprive yourself of good things in life in order to learn how to be content. That will really help preempt some of that argumentation. It's not necessary for you to bring it up in framing, just at some point in Prop 1 would be good. Moving on to argument ideas, one idea I had was on how religions would become less coercive, and I think I've already explained this. To reiterate, it's just that religions encouraging self-deprivation creates this ideal persona what a religious person should look like, and people are going to feel coerced into wanting to become, or coerced into aspiring to become that level of religious, right? A couple of reasons as to why this coercion would manifest. Firstly, you're going to want to be accepted by the community, right? And this community as a whole thinks that it's important for you to deprive yourself or self-deny in order for you to reach levels of spirituality. So in order to be accepted, you're going to want to do it yourself. Secondly, because religion strongly encourage it, in order to feel worthy of a connection with God, or in order to feel worthy of religion, you might want to aspire to do these things that lead to self-deprivation, right? And that could also be harmful. And finally, I think another reason why you'd likely be coerced is because you'd fear the repercussions of not doing it, both spiritually and also socially. So that's you establishing or mechanizing why coercion is going to take place. In terms of impacts, like I said earlier, there's going to be physical, mental, and economic harms on an individual. And also in terms of an impact on religion, it's going to create this very problematic hierarchy of sorts, right? Where a person would be considered more religious based on how much they deprive themselves of, and this creates a very problematic hierarchy of sorts and a race to the bottom, as I mentioned previously. I think final impact is how it really takes the focus away from more positive elements of religion, like community and like celebrating a spiritual connection that you have with God. Now you're so focused on depriving yourself of things, and you have to deal with all the negative consequences that leads to, that you no longer have the focus on the more positive and better parts of religion. Comparatively, on proposition side of the house, you can explain that you will be able to focus more on these positive practices that bring the community together, that celebrate hope and other good things about religion. Second argument idea is about how there'll be less religious extremism, and it's really important for you to frame this argument well, right? And you do that by explaining that most extremist groups glorify self-sacrifice and martyrdom, right? And these ideas, the ideas of self-sacrifice and martyrdom, essentially stem from the foundation of self-deprivation, right? The very idea of extremism stems from the belief of how important sacrifice is in religion. It is the narrative that these groups weaponize. So Thus, a religious framework that doesn't encourage self-deprivation would really undermine the whole basis of their justification. It would be like a contradiction, right? So because of that, on proposition side of the house, you'll have a lot less extremism. Comparatively, individuals are now going to feel valued and respected without needing to prove their devotion through these extreme measures. And that in turn is going to decrease the likelihood of people turning to radicalism, or it's going to decrease the likelihood of extremist groups being able to weaponize this narrative. So I think you could add further analysis there to try and solidify the link between self-sacrifice and how that leads to extremism. And you need to try and paint a picture as to how a world where religions don't encourage self-sacrifice or self-deprivation would be one where it's really hard for extremism, for people to turn towards extremism, because self-sacrifice to that extent is something that is no longer deemed important in religion. Final idea then is about how buy-in to religions would increase. The context for this argument is to say that in status quo there has been an increase in atheism, and also a lot of people have started leaving religion as they've started to question a lot of aspects of religion, including harmful practices like self-denial, right? And one of the primary reasons for this is people feel coerced, right? People feel coerced into these practices of self-denial, and they no longer feel like they have a genuine connection with God. To conceptualize this, it could look like young people being forced to dress a certain way or act a certain way against their will, all in the name of religion. And all these things that are forced on them has led to them no longer being able to celebrate or have a good connection with religion, right? So comparatively, on proposition side of the house, when religions are far less coercive and way more inclusive, people will now have the opportunity to forge a far more genuine relationship with God on their own terms, right? And this is not only going to benefit those individuals but also the religion as a whole, because now the religion is going to be able to retain a larger following, and they are also going to be able to influence a much larger group of individuals positively. But that's really it for proposition. Moving on to opposition, I think the first thing opposition should do at the very top of their case is redefine and recontextualize what self-denial or self-deprivation looks like. So self-deprivation in most instances doesn't look like the very extreme form of it that proposition portrays it to be, right? Where you abstain from all worldly pleasures. It's more so really cultivating this level of discipline within yourself, and the cultivating the ability to not get carried away with materialism and whatnot. So recontextualizing what self-denial looks like to something more positive is something that is absolutely integral for an opposition's case. I think the second thing that you should do as an opposition is try and disprove propositions counterfactual. Tell me why on proposition side of the house, religions are still likely to be coercive and still likely to have extremist aspects within them, right? And you do this by telling the house how propositions entire case is a problem solution mismatch. And the reason is because self-deprivation isn't the only thing that has led to coercion or extremism. For example, let's look at extremism, right? Extremism doesn't necessarily only stem from the idea of self-deprivation. It also stems from radical ideas of how worship should look like, right? This will exist even in a world where religions don't encourage self-deprivation, because the problem here isn't self-deprivation. It's that individuals have manipulated certain concepts within religion and made them coercive and made them extremist. The ability to manipulate narratives is going to be symmetric, and it's going to exist even in a world where self-deprivation does not exist. So through this analysis, you basically disprove props counterfactual, and you basically prove why all the harms that they want to get rid of don't necessarily disappear. In terms of argument ideas, I think one argument could be about how the identity and purpose of religions is really enshrined within this concept of self-deprivation. Because without self-deprivation, or the essence of it, forging a spiritual connection with God is going to be difficult. Because self-deprivation embodies the essence of contentment and not chasing worldly pleasures, which is the foundation of most religions. Without encouraging self-deprivation, you can't encourage detachment from this world. And without detachment from this world, you can't really focus on spirituality. So through this, you really establish the importance of self-deprivation to religions, and you explain why without it, the very purpose of religion would be lost. Another argument idea is on the benefits of self-deprivation for individuals, right? And this is again where you bring back the analysis on how propositions case is a problem solution mismatch, right? The harm they talk about isn't in self-deprivation, but the harm exists in self-depriving yourself at extreme levels. And you can explain how this isn't something that religions really recommend. Religions take into account circumstances and don't really mandate any form of self-sacrifice that is draconian. If you look at asceticism, in essence, what it really does is help you cope with the struggles of daily life by teaching you how to detach yourself from materialism. So what you're doing here is redefining how religions operate, right? No religion mandates harmful levels of self-deprivation, and anything that is mandated is for its followers to build a sense of discipline and build the ability to detach themselves from materialism and from chasing very short-term happiness, right? So it'll really help, and self-deprivation essentially is going to help you strive for contentment, which again is the very foundation of most religions. So proposition's problem really is that certain individuals are currently being victimized as a result of extreme versions of self-deprivation. What you have to do as an opposition is prove that this isn't a harm that they can get rid of, because on their side of the house, in the absence of self-deprivation, there will be other narratives which will be manipulated into victimizing these vulnerable people. So while they don't get rid of the harm, they do get rid of the exclusive benefit you have on your side of the house, and that benefit is the ability for people to strive towards contentment, because without self-deprivation it's going to be hard for you to detach yourself and strive for contentment. But yeah, I think that's about it for both sides, and yeah, thank you for watching.